John du Pont raised the revolver that had killed his Olympic wrestler. He had already pulled the trigger once. Now the same gun sat in his hand while the DuPont fortune that paid for it rotted around him in empty rooms. This contradiction defined his final years as the last direct heir to a chemical empire that once supplied entire armies, while he himself controlled almost nothing beyond the walls of Foxcatcher Farm. The revolver itself carried the weight of that original fortune. Its steel frame came from the early workshops where the first DuPont had secured government contracts that eliminated every rival in Delaware. Those contracts turned modest production into absolute dominance, and the profits flowed into interlocking trusts designed to keep every dollar inside the family for decades. Later heirs received shares that multiplied through wartime demand, but the structure ensured no single branch could touch the principal without approval from distant cousins. John received his portion in the mid-20th century, after the original estate was divided among multiple lines of descent. The split left each heir with substantial income, yet stripped away any real authority over the underlying assets. Family elders approved funding for his wrestling program, not out of enthusiasm for the sport, but as a calculated display of status that kept the DuPont name visible in elite athletic circles. The money arrived through trust distributions that still carried the restrictive language written a century earlier. That same language created the isolation visible in 1996. John could spend on private teams and lavish facilities, but he could never redirect the capital or sell the core holdings that generated the cash. The revolver remained in his possession as a tangible reminder of the monopoly tactics that had locked the wealth in place generations before. The early contracts and trusts had multiplied the fortune into something untouchable, yet they also produced heirs who inherited power without the ability to wield it. What nobody foresaw was how one overlooked clause in those same documents would later release restricted capital directly into John du Pont's hands and change everything at Foxcatcher. The revolver passed to John du Pont through direct descent from the powder mill founder, who had turned a small operation into the backbone of American munitions. His ancestors had divided the estate in the late 1800s among several branches of the family to prevent any one line from consolidating too much power. Each heir received income streams backed by government contracts, but the principal remained locked behind layers of trustees who answered only to the bloodline. This structure preserved the fortune across generations while breeding detachment in those who received it. The founder built his powder operation on the banks of the Brandywine River by securing contracts that no competitor could match. Government orders for black powder flowed directly to his mill, starting in the early 1800s. Those deals turned modest production into a flood of revenue that funded rapid expansion across Delaware. He used the cash to buy out rival operations at distressed prices. When smaller mills struggled with inconsistent supply or outdated equipment, he stepped in with offers backed by his military connections. This pattern repeated across multiple sites, folding independent producers into his growing network without open warfare. By the 1820s, the operation controlled sales of more than 1 million pounds of powder each year to Army and Navy buyers. The steady stream of federal payments created leverage for further acquisitions. Rival owners faced a choice between selling on his terms or watching their margins collapse under his pricing power. Interlocking trusts soon followed the buyouts. Capital from each new mill was routed into family-controlled entities that prevented outsiders from claiming shares. These structures multiplied the original holdings by keeping profits inside the bloodline, in shielding assets from market shocks or legal claims by non-family partners. The same contracts that drove the early growth also created barriers around the enterprise. Successive generations inherited not just wealth, but a closed system where decisions about expansion rested with trustees loyal only to the founding line. This setup turned every new government order into another layer of insulation from external competition. Control over key waterways and transport routes in Delaware added another edge. Mills located upstream or downstream found themselves dependent on DuPont logistics for raw materials and finished product delivery. Refusal to sell often meant sudden shortages that forced capitulation within months. The resulting monopoly stretched far beyond powder production itself. Profits from these deals seeded investments in land, banking ties, and political influence that protected the core business for decades. Each acquisition tightened the circle until few independent operations remained viable in the region. The trusts multiplied the fortune that later isolated John. The founder leveraged those military contracts to force sales from cash-strapped rivals. Powder demand surged with every new frontier conflict, giving him the liquidity to offer terms that independent operators could not refuse. Many Delaware mills changed hands after a single bad season left their owners vulnerable to his buying pressure. Interlocking trusts locked the gains in place. Each acquired site fed its earnings into a central pool managed by family-appointed guardians who rejected any outside investment. This mechanism turned short-term contract wins into permanent capital barriers that outsiders could never breach. The pattern of dominance extended through political channels as well. Family members cultivated ties that ensured renewal of exclusive supply agreements year after year. Rivals watched their access to federal orders shrink, while the original operation scaled without interruption. Such arrangements created an environment where wealth grew in isolation from market forces. Successive heirs inherited systems designed to multiply holdings rather than distribute them. The result was a fortune insulated from the very competition it had eliminated. This closed architecture would later allow John du Pont to draw on resources without answering to external oversight at Foxcatcher Farm. The founder extended his reach by targeting mills along the river that controlled key resources. He offered buyouts funded entirely by accumulated military payments. Owners who resisted soon faced supply cutoffs that crippled their production within months. Sales reached several £100,000 annually by the middle of the decade. This volume generated revenues sufficient to finance multiple simultaneous purchases across the region. Each transaction added capacity and eliminated potential threats from independent operators. The interlocking family trusts ensured that every new asset contributed to a shared pool. Trustees enforced rules that kept all profits circulating within the bloodline alone. External partners found no entry points into these arrangements, no matter how they tried to negotiate. Political connections reinforced the pattern of dominance over time. Renewed federal agreements arrived each year without competitive bidding from outsiders. Rivals watched their margins erode, while the central operation scaled its output without pause. This structure would multiply the fortune across generations and leave John du Pont with unchecked access decades later at Foxcatcher. The wartime contracts of the 1940s transformed an already insulated fortune into something nearly untouchable. DuPont chemical plants operated around the clock to meet military demand for explosives and synthetic materials. Output reached levels that earlier generations could never have imagined. Those profits funded a rapid expansion beyond gunpowder into plastics and industrial paints. The company secured exclusive deals that left competitors scrambling for scraps. Multiple estates rose across several states during this period. Each property reflected the scale of wartime windfalls. Private rail lines connected remote facilities directly to the main production hubs. These tracks bypassed public infrastructure entirely and allowed the family to move raw materials and finished goods without external interference. The arrangement kept costs low and information contained within trusted circles. Tariff legislation became another tool of control. Family members lobbied directly in Washington to raise barriers against foreign chemical imports. Rivals from Europe and Asia faced sudden cost spikes that protected domestic margins. The moves created an environment where diversification into new product lines happened without meaningful pushback. Wealth accumulated faster than the family could spend it on further isolation. This unchecked expansion produced an industrial bloc that operated with little external oversight. The same trusts established decades earlier now channeled enormous cash flows into personal projects across generations. No regulatory body could penetrate the layers of interlocking holdings. The result was a level of insulation that later allowed spending decisions to proceed without family consensus or public scrutiny. The empire reached its peak strength just as the next generation prepared to inherit the full weight of those arrangements. The empire reached its peak strength just as the next generation prepared to inherit the full weight of those arrangements. Wartime production had pushed annual revenues into the hundreds of millions of dollars by the middle of the 1940s. Plants across the eastern states churned out materials that fed both military needs and emerging civilian markets. Diversification into plastics and paints created fresh revenue streams that compounded the original chemical holdings. Those gains translated directly into personal assets for the inner circle of heirs. Construction of additional estates accelerated during this era of abundance. One sprawling property in Pennsylvania would later serve as the site for athletic training grounds. Others appeared in Delaware and New Jersey, each equipped with private amenities that underscored the family's separation from ordinary society. These homes required constant maintenance funded entirely from internal dividends. No public financing or external partnerships entered the equation. Private rail lines extended the reach of this isolation. Dedicated tracks linked remote manufacturing sites to distribution points without reliance on shared infrastructure. Shipments of raw chemicals and finished products moved under exclusive control. The system reduced cost while preventing outsiders from observing operational details. Maintenance crews answered only to family overseers. Tariff legislation provided another layer of protection. Influential voices within the family pushed for measures that raised import duties on competing chemical products. Foreign manufacturers encountered sudden price disadvantages that preserved domestic market share. These political efforts operated through established networks in Washington rather than open debate. The result was a fortified position where expansion faced few barriers from abroad. This combination of production scale and legal safeguards created an industrial bloc that operated beyond standard accountability. Cash flows from the wartime years continued to feed the trusts without interruption. Heirs received distributions that supported extravagant projects, while the core capital remained shielded. The structure eliminated any need for consensus among distant relatives on spending decisions. John du Pont would later draw from these resources to build his own vision at Foxcatcher Farm. The absence of oversight meant that individual ambitions could proceed without collective review. Such freedom carried forward the momentum of earlier monopolistic tactics into a new era of personal excess. Yet these same structures would soon face pressures that no wartime boom could shield them from. John du Pont channeled that unchecked freedom into a sprawling property acquisition that would define his later years. He bought the Foxcatcher estate outright for $700,000 in cash drawn from family distributions. The transaction stood apart from any cousin approval process. At Foxcatcher, he poured resources into training facilities that centered on his personal John du Pont wrestling interests. Those facilities grew into a private compound where Olympic-level athletes trained under his direct control. Boardroom clashes erupted among the cousins when dividend policies came up for review in the 1980s. Some relatives pushed for larger annual payouts to fund their own ventures, while others insisted on preserving capital inside the existing trusts. John stood apart from these arguments because his estate purchase had already locked in a separate stream of distributions. The debates exposed deep rifts over how the original powder mill legacy should translate into modern spending. Each side hired separate legal teams that turned routine meetings into prolonged negotiations. Tax rule changes added pressure to the old structures during the same decade. New legislation limited the ability of perpetual trusts to shield assets from federal levies without active business operations. The du Pont cousins watched as portions of their shielded capital faced fresh reporting requirements. John used the shifting environment to argue for greater personal access to estate funds that had previously required collective sign-off. His position gained traction precisely because the family lacked any unified front on the matter. The John du Pont Foxcatcher true story unfolded against this backdrop of internal division. Mark Schultz and Dave Schultz entered the training program at Foxcatcher Farm under arrangements financed through these loosened distributions. The program operated without the oversight that once governed the larger chemical holdings. Tensions mounted as the cousins continued their dividend disputes, while John expanded his wrestling operations without restraint. These fractures marked the first real test of the wartime structures that had protected the fortune for decades. The du Pont family murder legacy would trace directly back to the unresolved questions over control and access that surfaced in those years. The trusts had multiplied wealth across generations, but now faced erosion from both external laws and internal ambitions that no single heir could contain. The cousins continued to clash in closed sessions, where each group presented spreadsheets projecting different outcomes from the same trust holdings. John remained detached from these sessions because his Foxcatcher purchase had already secured independent access to capital streams. This separation allowed him to focus resources on expanding the wrestling compound without needing to justify expenditures to distant relatives. The John du Pont wrestling program attracted top athletes who trained on grounds maintained through those private allocations. Yet the lack of unified family input created gaps where spending decisions escaped any collective scrutiny. Tax reforms in the 1980s introduced new filing requirements that forced the heirs to reevaluate how distributions were allocated across generations. Lawyers for the various branches argued over clauses that had once kept capital locked inside perpetual structures. John leveraged these arguments to secure releases that funded additional facilities at Foxcatcher Farm. The Dave Schultz murder would later highlight how such isolated control operated without external checks. Mark Schultz Foxcatcher experiences unfolded in this environment, where one heir's vision dictated daily operations at the estate. These internal battles revealed the limits of the original interlocking trusts when applied to modern personal projects. Cousins who favored conservative dividend policies watched as John's spending patterns drew from the same pools they sought to protect. The Foxcatcher true story emerged from this period of fractured oversight, where individual access trumped group consensus. Boardroom disputes dragged on through multiple rounds of negotiations that produced no clear resolution on long-term capital allocation. The du Pont family murder case would trace its roots to the unchecked personal authority that these disputes ultimately enabled. Pressure mounted as external regulators examined the trusts for compliance with updated statutes on generational wealth transfers. John used the resulting uncertainty to accelerate his Foxcatcher Olympic wrestling plans before any new restrictions could apply. The absence of coordinated resistance among the cousins left room for these expansions to proceed at full pace. Foxcatcher Farm murder details would later expose the consequences of this freedom when personal ambitions collided with operational realities at the estate. Such dynamics shifted the balance from collective empire maintenance toward fragmented individual control. The John du Pont Foxcatcher Farm setup stood as a direct result of these eroded safeguards. Heirs who once benefited from unified wartime profits now competed for slices of a structure that no longer enforced shared restraint. This transition exposed vulnerabilities that earlier generations had avoided through strict bloodline protocols. The Foxcatcher Farm killing would serve as the stark illustration of how those vulnerabilities played out in practice. Yet the full mechanics of the trust maneuvers that enabled this phase remained hidden until court records surfaced years later. The overlooked clause sat buried in the 1930s trust documents. It granted any heir who pursued athletic or educational initiatives direct access to capital without requiring unanimous family consent. John du Pont exploited that single provision to funnel millions into his wrestling program. Other beneficiaries remained locked in disputes over dividend policies, while he operated alone. This mechanism transformed protected family wealth into private spending power that no prior generation had activated. Court filings in the 1990s forced the release of those restricted funds. Legal teams presented arguments that the original clause still applied despite decades of layered amendments. Judges approved the distributions after reviewing the archaic language that earlier heirs had ignored. The released capital flowed straight into Foxcatcher operations without oversight from cousins or trustees. Isolation at the estate deepened once those payments began arriving on schedule. The Foxcatcher true story hinges on this exact legal opening. John du Pont wrestling ambitions required sustained financing that standard trust rules would have blocked. The clause bypassed those rules and allowed construction of training facilities and recruitment of athletes like Dave Schultz. Mark Schultz, Foxcatcher connections, followed the same money trail. The du Pont family murder emerged from an environment where one heir controlled resources that the broader bloodline could no longer restrain. This arrangement closed the loop on the hidden trust mechanism introduced years earlier. The 1930s language had always contained the potential for unilateral action, yet remained dormant until economic pressures and shifting tax laws exposed it. Once activated, the clause severed the last threads of collective accountability that had preserved the fortune across generations. John operated in a vacuum that the original drafters never anticipated. The resulting independence produced the John du Pont Foxcatcher Farm enclave. Daily decisions at the property reflected spending patterns no external family member could veto. The fatal event that ended Dave Schultz's life traced directly back to resources unlocked by that single, overlooked sentence. Later settlements confirmed the clause had operated precisely as the court records described. What followed was the final fragmentation of the original holdings into separate portfolios that no single heir could reassemble. The clause operated like a hidden valve in an otherwise sealed system. It permitted targeted withdrawals for personal projects that aligned with education or sport. John activated it to sustain Foxcatcher without external review. This created a private channel that bypassed the interlocking protections built by earlier generations. The result was an autonomous operation shielded from the family consensus that once governed every major expenditure. Court proceedings in the 1990s exposed the precise wording that had survived multiple revisions. Attorneys argued that athletic funding qualified under the original intent, even though the document predated modern tax structures. The rulings unlocked capital flows that reached several $1 million annually. Those payments supported facilities, coaching staff, and athlete stipends at Foxcatcher Farm. Isolation intensified because no other heir held equivalent authority to intervene. The Foxcatcher true story reveals how this legal bypass turned inherited wealth into unchecked personal domain. John du Pont, Dave Schultz interactions occurred inside a compound financed through that route. Mark Schultz, Foxcatcher ties, followed the same pattern of independent recruitment. The du Pont family murder unfolded in a setting where one individual controlled resources that collective trust rules had previously contained. Earlier safeguards against solitary action had been neutralized by the court interpretation. That activation resolved the open loop around the 1930s documents. The mechanism had always existed, yet stayed dormant until economic shifts and individual ambition aligned. Once engaged, it severed the final layer of shared accountability. John du Pont. Foxcatcher Farm decisions reflected this new reality of solitary command. The John du Pont wrestling enterprise expanded precisely because the clause removed any requirement for family sign-off. Later reviews of estate records confirmed the direct line from the clause to the property's operational freedom. No additional approvals were needed once the funds cleared the trust barrier. This structure enabled the daily routines and investments that defined the estate in its final years. The solitary command at Foxcatcher revealed a deeper fracture already forming across the entire legacy. Corporate spin-offs in the 2000s carved away the core chemical divisions piece by piece. Each transaction funneled cash into separate accounts rather than any central pool. Heirs received their portions through layered investment vehicles that operated independently of one another. The original powder mill sites stood abandoned or repurposed without any family member holding coordinated oversight. Those sales delivered billions, yet spread the proceeds across dozens of trusts and private funds. Surviving family vehicles today manage holdings valued in the low hundreds of millions rather than the industrial scale once commanded. No single entity retains authority over the Delaware riverfront properties that launched the empire. Dispersed portfolios chase routine market returns instead of strategic monopolies. The absence of unified control turned what had been a fortress of capital into ordinary collections of stocks and real estate. This fragmentation closed the arc that began with the founders' government contracts and ended with isolated spending at Foxcatcher Farm. The Foxcatcher true story stands as the clearest symptom of that final break. Once legal barriers fell, the money flowed outward without restraint. Later generations inherited the results as fragmented accounts rather than a living block. The pattern repeats across other dynasties, where early mechanisms of control dissolve under later pressures. The fortune now operates like any modern portfolio exposed to quarterly cycles and tax codes. No one steers the remaining assets toward new industrial dominance. The powder mill origins have faded into historical markers visited by tourists rather than active sites of power. John du Pont Foxcatcher Farm decisions accelerated the very isolation that made such dispersal inevitable once the last shared structures vanished. Wealth of this magnitude rarely vanishes outright. It simply loses its center of gravity until individual ambitions replace collective force. If stories like the DuPont family murder still resonate, consider what similar fractures might exist elsewhere. The remaining assets now sit in separate hands, with no mechanism left to pull them back together. Individual family members direct their shares toward private equity or real estate, without regard for the old industrial base. The chemical divisions sold off in those later transactions produced steady returns for new owners, yet left the DuPont name attached only to history rather than active production. Sites once central to powder manufacturing stand quiet under different management, or turned into parks. This dispersal removed any chance of renewed dominance in manufacturing or legislation. Heirs today navigate standard investment risks that earlier generations never faced. Market swings affect their holdings directly. Tax changes chip away at returns without the old trust shields to blunt the impact. The Foxcatcher Olympic wrestling murder fits into this picture as one extreme outcome of solitary control over funds that once required collective approval. No board or cousin group could intervene once the clause unlocked the flow. Such patterns leave the original empire as scattered pieces rather than a single force. The powder mill legacy survives only in archives and local markers. Modern portfolios chase yields that pale against the scale of wartime contracts or rail line constructions. Individual choices replace the interlocking trusts that once locked capital inside the bloodline. Wealth of this magnitude rarely vanishes outright. It simply loses its center of gravity until individual ambitions replace collective force. If stories like the DuPont family murders still resonate, consider what similar fractures might exist elsewhere. The investment vehicles themselves have evolved into standard vehicles managed by professional advisors. Annual reports show modest growth tied to broader markets. No trace remains of the interlocking trusts that once amplified power across generations. Private equity stakes replace the old government contracts and tariff protections that built the original monopoly. Family members now compete in the same open arenas as any other investor without the advantage of bloodline barriers. This outcome stems directly from the clause that unlocked solitary access at Foxcatcher. What began as a mechanism for one man's wrestling program exposed the entire structure to permanent division. The Foxcatcher Farm murder marked the moment when isolation turned deadly, because no external check remained on spending or decisions. Mark Schultz Foxcatcher accounts and the broader John du Pont wrestling network operated in that vacuum until external forces intervened. Wealth of this magnitude rarely vanishes outright. It simply loses its center of gravity until individual ambitions replace collective force. If stories like the DuPont family murder still resonate, consider what similar fractures might exist elsewhere. Subscribe for the next chapter on how other dynasties navigated the same collapse.